Hello and welcome to the Omnex webinar, Lean and Six Sigma for Competitive Advantage. Today's webinar is being presented by Dave Watkins. Dave Watkins is the Executive Vice President of Omnex. Dave has a wide range of experience encompassing full profit and loss responsibility in general management, as well as manufacturing, production, human resources, and distribution management in a variety of industries. His expertise includes extensive work with the Ford Motor Company, including being on the Ford QOS development team and assisting with the implementation of Ford Q1. Again, this webinar is Lean and Six Sigma for Competitive Advantage. Today's presenter is Dave Watkins. Dave, you can take it away.
Thanks, Miles, for that kind introduction. Good morning, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this very abbreviated discussion of Lean and Six Sigma in an enterprise context. Presumably, many of you are in organizations which, to a greater or lesser degree, have chosen to use Lean techniques and perhaps Six Sigma. And from my personal experience, it's likely that a lot of the organizations in which you're involved have struggled with this. And so in this webinar, while I'm going to speak somewhat about some of the basic methodologies, just to bring some of you perhaps up to speed to a certain degree, I really want to address this from the what in my personal experience has been a flawed approach that I see in many organizations, which are predicated on the idea that by selecting individual products or processes and performing some sort of structured project approach, whether going all the way back to PICOs or coming forward to Kaizen events, and even the DMAIC approach that I'm going to be talking about, ultimately these initiatives have failed because you cannot do this in isolation within an enterprise where the rest of the systems and processes of the enterprise have not evolved to enable a lean and highly capable process. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding that everything else about the enterprise can remain the same, while just the production processes and perhaps logistics processes are leaned out, if you will, and have Six Sigma projects performed on them. So, the questions are if you're employing techniques for achieving operational excellence, is it working? Are the changes that have been achieved significant? Are they sustainable? Are they driving continual improvement? Is it part of the organization's culture? Do you have ongoing plans and strategies to continue to drive down process variation and defect levels internally and externally to improve flow? And we're going to talk a little bit about how the project methodology supports this but doesn't provide the ultimate solution. In our experience, integrated Lean Six Sigma and operational excellence is an enterprise-wide strategy, and it has to be employed to engage all of the key business processes in an approach to change, because all those business processes exist to enable the value stream process to be successful. And if you try simply to re-engineer the value stream without re-engineering the rest of the enterprise, typically we're not successful, even though we may see short-term gains in a given product or process. Somehow long-term it isn't sustained, and you should expect to achieve significant savings and at the same time evolve the enterprise. Those of you engaged in Lean and or Six Sigma or some version of operations excellence are no doubt familiar with the idea of a DMAIC, define, measure, analyze, improve, and control approach to projects. It's a logic which is inescapable, actually. The defining phase is determining what your issues are, what your objectives are, and planning how you're going to attack them. The measure and analyze phases are for the obtaining knowledge. To put it simply, measurement provides information, analysis provides us with knowledge gained from the information, and that knowledge coming out of analysis enables us to identify options, evaluate those options, make decisions, and act on those decisions, and then sustain the change by systemic change, by changing our system processes, documentation, monitoring, measurement, and how we monitor and control improvement. But if you take this project strategy of DMAIC and don't extend it to the entire enterprise, I will tell you personally, you are bound to be frustrated. So, taking a quick review, what is lean? Well, lean is simply a systematic approach to removing the waste from processes and activities and maximizing the value, the use of our resources to generate value. It happens by optimizing flow, by eliminating the various kinds of wastes that accumulate around and within processes, by converting from push to pull systems, by gradually, like a chain, if you lay a chain out on a table and you push at one end, all it does is clump up, whereas if you put your finger on the other end and pull it, it will straighten out and eventually become a lean, if not one-piece flow, a flow which is continuous and which is pulled by demand rather than pushed by scheduling. The cost of poor flow historically has been reasonably well defined, but not necessarily well understood, because we see the symptoms of it, the evidence of it in the part of the classic image of the iceberg sticking out of the water, and this is hardly an original image. I'm putting it in here simply to remind us of where below the line, below where our accounting systems go, below where our traditional organizational structures can monitor and perceive the amount of waste within a system. And then there is this idea that in order to eliminate all that waste, there are enormous costs to be incurred. And I have to tell you from personal experience, one single process that a group of a team of people in a plant that I was responsible for took a process that started out taking 7 to 9 weeks to realize product shipments to the customer, 7 to 9 week product cycle time, 300,000 to 400,000 pieces of in-process inventory, and an internal scrap and rework rate of over 7%, with no capital investment. And in the course of about 7 months, a team of people on the shop floor owning that process took it down to 7-hour product cycle time, less than 1,000 pieces of in-process inventory, and internal scrap rate of less than 1% without capital investment. And that I bring that up just to illustrate the idea that this does not necessitate significant investment to accomplish. It begins, by the way, with this simple perception of how little of the time the product is in our system that we're actually adding value to it. This classic picture here is actually an overstatement in my experience. 5% would be pretty good in a lot of processes. Now today, 15 or 20 years on with employing some of these systems and methods, it may be closer to the average, but initial processes that I have studied and that my associates have studied start out sometimes at below 2% of the time that material is in our possession that we're adding value to it. And the non-value added time is enormous. There's in lean a classic mathematic ratio that you calculate as you lean out the process of what the percentage of value added time is compared to the overall time, and watching that number change is fascinating. Most of you have probably been exposed to these 7 wastes. I think, though, that some of them are underappreciated, particularly defects. I think defects in the organizations I work with, I find that they're still costing defects on the basis of accumulated cost up to the point that a part is rendered from a good part to a bad part. And one of the things I encourage organizations to do is to revalue those defects, first of all, in terms of their revenue value, because you've got a part that until you add more work to it, you're not going to get paid for. And while you're adding that additional work, you're not going to be making another part that you would get paid for. And there's an arguable case in a continuous operation that there is a virgin part, if you will, one that could be sold that will never be made because the capacity of the process and the resources were used to fix the part that was made wrong in the first place. It's not an irrational approach to take to value a defective part at 3 times its revenue value in terms of the impact on the bottom line. The other wastes, transportation, unnecessary motion, unnecessary operations, waiting, overproduction. Overproduction is also one of the signal wastes in almost every organization that we see if they are not working on a pure pull JIT basis. And of course, all of the human potential that's involved in these wastes is wasted. And a little nod to Scott Adams there. By the way, I'm going to be going through some of these slides relatively quickly, so I urge you to take Miles' advice, and when you are contacted that the slides are available, that you download a copy of this presentation. The classic lean strategies, if you read Learning to See or The Gold Mine by Ballet Father and Son, if you haven't read them, then I would strongly urge that you do. But one of the things I want to stress about these methods or strategies is that they are just that. They are methods. If you employ these methods and don't re-engineer the system within which they work, the impact of changes to these processes will be minimal. The organizations I've seen that have been genuinely successful at this have re-engineered a facility, if you will, all the way up to the plant manager's office. And all of the systems and processes have been re-engineered to enable this lean and capable process, because we're going to talk about how when you are leaning out a process, you have to use Six Sigma techniques to get that process to be capable, because it's axiomatic that a process that is not capable cannot be lean, and a process that is not lean cannot be capable. The lack of flow will introduce variation at various points that add to the variation in the process. So the key thing here is that while learning to see and employing these lean methods are essential to achieving a lean process, you can also employ the techniques taught by Goldratt in constraint management theory and the goal, and end up at the same place. Because if there's an argument in favor of the theory of constraints, is that it factors in variation and the need for variation reduction in the same way that it factors in flow. So we take these lean strategies to work on flow, and one of the things I've done in this presentation is leave the shop floor to talk about 2 environments that are not manufacturing, purposefully to show how flow in any process can be enhanced. In this case, the case study I'm talking about is a healthcare project. It was an outpatient facility. It had 14 physicians, 22 medical technicians, and administrative staff. And the problem was, 1, patient wait time was outrageous. When you combine visit time and wait time, with all of that, the physician face time with patients was much lower than it should have been, and the technicians involved were overworked in the sense that they couldn't keep up, and as a result, you had this herky-jerky, and the victim of the herky-jerkies were the patients and the doctors. So we followed classic define, measure, analyze, improve, and control. We mapped the processes, identified, gathered data by tracking 1,200 patients over a 2-week period, and isolating to a single common flow and defining that as the value stream for the project. We captured data on waiting time versus encounter time. That's time patients were waiting versus time they were face-to-face with the doctor. We tracked data that showed that their arrival times, the patients had developed a learned response, that because the clinic scheduled a bunch of people to arrive at each hour and half hour, the patients learned to come early so they could try to move to the front of the line. And all that did was, it's like overloading a plant process. It simply created a pile of patients waiting to be seen. We then analyzed the workflow of the technicians performing examinations prior to the doctor, discovered there was an amazing range of variation in the cycle time of the technicians. We looked at the doctor times and recognized there was a significant difference in the amount of time that each doctor spent with a patient and how much time patients waited in front of the doctor's office, having gone through the technicians. We worked our way through the flow, reversed it into a pull based on the doctor's encounter cycle time, because part of the rules were you couldn't touch whatever the doctor was doing when interfacing. So we simply developed data that showed us what each doctor's encounter cycle time was, used that as the basis for a pull process, and that led to scheduling appointments based on each physician's encounter time, prep cycle times, and arrival time. The impact simply was patient visit time was reduced by 26% initially. I understand subsequent to that it was reduced further to close to a 40% reduction. The wait time within the visit time was reduced overall by 26%. Their wait time ultimately was reduced by about 40%. This actually resulted in the physicians having more face time with patients, more billable time, if you will, and increased revenue. And because of this, they eliminated waiting areas. They were able to add 2 physician and examination rooms without an additional building and without any additional technicians or administrative staff. So they got a big boost in overall capacity without any significant change in overall staff. Now, having said that, when you're doing this with a process, I said before that it's axiomatic that a process to be lean has to be capable. So there's really no logical way to separate Six Sigma from lean. When Six Sigma is looking at what are the systemic causes of variation and how do we apply a scientific, fact-based, and data-driven process to breaking through and reducing significantly the amount of waste and variation. And when you link that with lean, you get this strategy for a project result, which is actually significantly greater than what you see from the classic calculations of Six Sigma, following the same idea that we measure the waste caused by variation, that is the cost of poor quality, in terms that don't get us to the systemic root causes and don't get us to the systemic costs that are below the line, that are embedded in variable factory overhead, that are embedded in administrative costs, and are not reflected in the costing of the product, but are there. And it's been estimated, and I'm not showing you anything new because the facts haven't changed, that at a cost of poor quality of 20-25%, which is not high, we see the idea that organizations, their production processes are at 2 to 3 sigma, and they have PPM levels like this. We are running into companies in a variety of industries outside of automotive where PPM levels in the 20 to 60,000 are not unusual, that are at 4 sigma in their process. I think what you have to do with this classic chart and the classic data here is to recognize that it is the sigma, that is the variation and effectiveness of a lot of your other business processes, which are now dragging on production processes which may have very low PPMs, and in the automotive industry it's not unusual to see first and second tier companies with PPM levels at or below 5, below 3. I even know 2 companies that are measuring parts per billion because they don't get enough defects to count in parts per million. But that the knowledge of the impact of variation that they have focused on in their production processes is not accounting for the waste and inefficiency and the variability of other key business processes, which have to be pulled into this overall strategy. An example of a Lean Six Sigma project applied in a logistics context. This was basically a facility that took defective field returns, put them into a repair process, and then returned them for replacement in the servicing and warranty servicing of vehicles as refurbished units. And what the analysis of this process showed was that it was incredibly inefficient, that they needed to, one, minimize the amount of time that these units were in receiving and then in transit to the refurbishing, and then hanging around in refurbishing, and then the transit back to delivery, in large part because, not being a pull process, they were repairing as they came rather than repairing based on what was needed. And the fundamental change that came from this was to use Six Sigma to reduce the variation in the activities and eliminate a lot of the systemic causes of that variation, but at the same time to convert the process to a pull process to enhance flow. And you can study these numbers at your leisure if you download this. I'm not going to read them all to you, other than to say that the red figures had to change significantly, and after the analysis and the institution of some very specific improvement strategies, principal one being to utilize a pull system for refurbishment to storage, that is to repair and move to storage those units that were in demand as they were demanded, rather than simply pushing them through as they came in from the world out there, and to use both Six Sigma and Lean techniques to manage and essentially eliminate inventory at the outlet end, and to control it at the input end. In the end, they reduced the logistical content from an average of 14.6 to 5.2 man days. They reduced non-test goods receipt volume by a reduction of about 65%, and eliminated the handling of OEM parts that would be refurbished outside the facility at an average of about 43%. The overall impact of this project was gross savings in excess of $1 million, or 9.4 full-time equivalent staff members. The key thing to look at here was both the elimination of systemic causes of variation and failure, and the application of Lean techniques to convert to a pull process and significantly enhance the flow. And not only enhance the flow, but raise customer satisfaction by getting the required components delivered when they were needed, as opposed to stacking up an inventory of parts that were not needed, or units that were not needed at the time they were repaired. Which is sort of an introduction then to this idea of how Lean Six Sigma works. And there you see on this title slide the axiom that we think drives this whole concept, which is that a process has to be capable to be lean, and a process has to be lean to be capable. And adding to that idea that includes the business support and provisioning processes that enable your value stream. So your procurement processes, staffing processes, maintenance processes, equipment acquisition processes, tool design, development, All of those processes need to be made lean and capable to enable the value stream process to be lean and capable. That includes looking at how accounting systems work, because accounting systems are not aligned with and don't comprehend well the change in the nature of process cost, if you will, and revenue generation. Is still this tendency to break processes down into unit costs and labor hours. The system is not designed to accurately comprehend the actual baseline start of change, nor to adequately comprehend the impact on cost and on revenue of these kinds of changes. So you get this conflict between IT systems, between accounting systems, and actually business planning processes if they are not reworked to align with your realization process as it is re-engineered to be lean and highly capable. So when we look at the leanness or efficiency and the optimal flow of the realization process, wherein we have less variability, fewer defects, and therefore the flow can be optimal, and flow is optimal and therefore doesn't contribute to variation in the causes of defects, you get this accelerated process. And I can tell you from early implementations, including the one I described at the beginning, where we took a process from 7 to 9 weeks down to 7 hours, that the whole accounting system had to be reworked. And the IT system that was young and primitive at the time, because this was a number of years ago, all of them had to be rethought as we took this one process and used it to, as we put it at the time, blow up the company. Because effectively, we did that. We blew up the company and reorganized it around these modules that were self-managed business units based on becoming extremely lean and extremely capable. And we distributed major resources, people from various departments into these cells. So the structure of the company, the structure of its procurement processes, the structure of its materials acquisition, and its whole approach to costing and pricing and to resource planning had to be restructured to account for the fundamental changes made in the overall system. That leads to the need to take what we're doing in our management system and our business scorecards, our KPIs, and rethink them in terms of developing the data that enables us to analyze all of the business processes, to gain the knowledge to understand where and how each process, including the value stream process, need to change, evaluating the options, acting on those options, and using these scorecards to, as we'll see, to sorry, I lost track of how I was handling this presentation there. To work first at knowledge, that the work that has to be done has to begin with people, and with awareness, and with knowledge, and with developing new competencies that are required to support new methods, and to develop policies and procedures that enable this approach rather than fight it, if you will. Then looking into the processes themselves to re-engineer so that they are lean and have the reduced systemic variation that allows for Six Sigma quality. And that is in all processes, not just the realization process, that results ultimately in competitive advantage that it says improve satisfaction. It's not talking only about customer satisfaction. It's thinking in terms of the business operating system, customer satisfaction, stakeholder, stockholder, investor satisfaction, employee satisfaction, and the satisfaction of other interested parties like the legal and regulatory environment and the communities within which we operate. So how does Lean Six Sigma work? Well, again, it works in this context of an enterprise change which selects projects and executes projects as part of an overall strategy for the enterprise, not simply as we need to take this product and this production process and make it lean. Projects are chosen as part of an overall strategy at the business planning level. I have heard so many executives tell me, we went out and we invested an immense amount of money in training black belts and green belts and yellow belts and white belts, and nothing happened. And the simple explanation for it was that they were simply trained and turned loose, and there was no business strategy. And underlying that strategy, successive, very consciously developed business plans to employ this competency and knowledge to drive overall change in the enterprise. An element of that is the idea that you select and you develop your most competent people to work in these projects, to have these competencies, anticipating that they are going to evolve beyond this into senior management and have this experience under their belt. But it's important that we develop and engage the right people in this and have them thinking in terms of an enterprise strategy, not simply a project strategy. The project workshops then are built around integrating both achieving the effect desired of a given project following DMAIC, but also integrating that into the overall system evolution of the enterprise. One of the other errors that this bullet point speaks to is the need to have committed resources. Part of the fundamental theory behind Six Sigma was to create these resources and dedicate them, particularly black belts. Well, whether they're lean sensei, or they're Six Sigma black belts, or they're Lean Six Sigma master black belts, or whatever term you want to give them, they are dedicated resources. And this kind of systemic elemental change in the organization and the effective management and implementation of projects is not going to happen unless these dedicated resources are enabled and provided with supporting resources to be successful. Now, there's a history behind this of saying that companies start with selecting projects. And my argument in this is that selecting projects is part of the initial step to enterprise transformation. That projects are used to not just obtain or achieve the objective of the individual project, but to make sure that each project is a part of a systemic building process, which is building this change throughout the enterprise. In order for that to happen, though, projects have to demonstrate success. They have to have high impact. They have to generate measurable, not just cost savings, but measurable performance enhancements, shortened product cycle times, better on-time delivery, less waste, and less variation that is generating defects, rework, and customer returns. We have to start from having baseline data. So this is sort of traditional structured approach, linking what we're doing in a project to the business goals, linking them to the business plan. So this project is part of a business plan to achieve specific enterprise objectives, that we manage the knowledge developed through each of these projects, and create a knowledge base to support iterative steps down the road to change in the enterprise. Data management planning and structure so that data are collected in a way that supports conversion, if you will, to information and enables analysis. And the result is the evolving knowledge we can apply to not just individual projects, but systemically across and then up through the enterprise to achieve significant change. Using critical metrics at the enterprise level and aligning and linking them with process metrics, not just the realization process, but the efficiency and effectiveness metrics of all of our business processes. And then selecting projects that have proven insoluble in the past. There are a lot of those, people sometimes refer to them as the elephant in the middle of the room. The problem that has been so entrenched that we just accept it as part of the state of the state. And recognizing that that's a fallacy, and taking on those kinds of projects because they will produce the significant impact. Where do you look for project ideas? Well, follow the pain. Customer complaints, critical characteristics in our KPIs, reject rates, on-time delivery performance, long lead times, long new product introduction cycle times, capacity limitations, several different manufacturing facilities I've been responsible for. I had engineers telling me we needed new equipment, and what we really discovered was that they could get new equipment when they had gotten optimal capacity performance out of existing equipment, and frequently that meant that new equipment really wasn't needed. It was getting material to flow through the existing equipment in a way that could satisfy demand without adding unnecessary capacity. There's pain there. There's pain in warranty, internal rejects. Every day, what are the problems we find ourselves fighting with? Where do we see overruns in what we're expending for various types of resources? These are all sharp sticks. And the question is, which collection of sharp sticks make for the best initial projects? But I can't stress enough the idea that the project, while it's essential to improving performance, it's not the end game. It is the projects that, as we develop them, change the organization. We did 3 years of integrated Lean Six Sigma Green Belt and Black Belt projects in an enormous petroleum company. And over the course of all of these, I think there were 170 different projects ultimately that were undertaken. What happened was a transformation of the operating levels of that organization, so that fundamentally how they did things changed. It was the accumulated impact of the projects, but also the accumulated impact of the change in system that was developing and overseeing and managing these projects. So you can distill it down to things that cause the company a lot of pain. Well, the things that cause our customers, our stockholders, and our employees a lot of pain. And that's where we get the strategic approach to project selection rather than the immediate short-term impact. So obviously, project selection requires evaluation of what will be the impact, not just financial impact. Financial impact is going to be a byproduct of the reduced resource utilization, the reduced time, the higher volume of flow, the reduced amount of waste in terms of scrap and rework. The financial impact will show up, but it will be a byproduct of the reduction in waste, the reduction in the ineffective and inefficient use of resources. Time to complete. There's a strategy that says in the beginning you want quick victories. I can't argue with that because there is this learning curve that particularly mid and senior level management need to go through. They're in a show me mode, and the more that it can be shown what kind of impact can be achieved by smaller steps in the beginning and then larger steps, the more you gradually get an enterprise-wide commitment to this kind of change. The same is true of the likelihood of success. We can target early projects for those things where there's a very high likelihood of success as part of the acclimatization, if you will, to the organization, to a belief in the effectiveness of this kind of systemic approach. The damage that some of the Kaizen approaches I have seen in organizations, by the way, as sort of a caveat here, is that they get short-term success in small projects, but because the enterprise around those projects, say you take a production process in the plant, do a Kaizen event, cellularize it, get this nice, neat, tight little cellular process sitting here, and the rest of the plant hasn't changed, and none of the support systems or processes have changed, then in all likelihood that success is going to disappear over a short period of time, and then we'll get a reaction from middle and senior management saying, see, I told you it wouldn't work. Well, the change doesn't come from the shop floor up. It comes from leadership committing to, believing in, and then enabling projects to be successful, but more importantly, to be sustained. I don't know how many of you have been in a plant where you see the residue of a 5S program that was initiated, and there are still bulletin boards around and shadow boards and all kinds of things that were evidence that at one time there was a 5S process. But because the rest of the processes and systemic issues within the organization weren't addressed, gradually the 5S, like any other unsupported discipline, loses its newness, it loses its sheen, and gradually the disciplines involved erode. And at some point, a couple of years down the road, you're looking around and saying, what happened to that? This will happen with almost any of these kinds of projects if they're not integrated into the enterprise. The idea that you look at projects from an investment and return, yeah, there's a classic argument that says you should expect for this much investment, you should expect this kind of return on projects. And it's been proven over and over again. We've experienced this. We had one organization we worked with where the overall investment in Six Sigma in the first year and a half was about, as I recall, $2.5 to $3 million. The project returns were well over $35 million a year. And that was by their accounting department's estimates. It should be expected that you'll get somewhere between 10 times to 20 times the return for the investment. But I think even more importantly is if these returns are going to be sustained, then they have to occur in this context of an evolution of the enterprise towards this becoming the norm rather than becoming something extraordinary. That organizations that treat Lean Six Sigma projects, that treat operations excellence as extraordinary projects, ultimately fail. Ultimately, the initiative fails. Here's a short list of case studies from our history. They simply illustrate the kind of return that is possible. But I will tell you, in some of these, I could go back a number of years later and see that this was sustained. I could also go back to a couple of them and say, not so much. It has to do with the discipline and the expectations and the business planning that sustains this kind of an initiative and converts it from an initiative into the culture of the organization. And the practices become sustained practices, which are not something extraordinary. They are integrated into the way, quote unquote, that's how we do business. That's how we do things around here. That's what makes these case studies translate into long-term sustainable strategic impact. Having said that, these were some serious returns on investment, and they were high-impact projects that more than compensated the enterprise for their initial investment in it. But the organizations in this group that sustain this are the ones that achieve long-term benefit. So this is just taking the classic Darwinian theory that says adapt or change. And adaptation to becoming lean enterprises, and I must tell you, I've been in any number of manufacturing facilities in the last 4 or 5 years that were truly lean, including some that had been traditional kind of bat caves of production, 70s and 80s style job shop environments, which have been revolutionized and are state of the art and lean from the plant manager's office down to the janitor's office, and extremely profitable. And that was a result of a complete remaking of the enterprise, not simply going out and converting production processes from linear to cellular processes. So the Darwinian message of adapt or die we've been seeing it over the last few years. We have seen any number of major organizations kind of disappear either by being swallowed up or simply disappear. I'm going to get into answering some questions, but I simply want to point out this is a tiny little sales pitch, if you will, which is simply to the effect of we've been doing this for a long time. We teach it. We lead facilitated projects. We develop green belts and black belts, but we also work hard with organizations to incorporate this into their overall management system and their management system strategies. So if you either visit our website or look through the PowerPoint when it's made available to you, you can get some idea of what kind of support we can provide. So that gets me to the end of the talk, and just time to answer a couple of questions that have come in. And if now would be the time, if you have a question and you haven't posted it. Let's see, I have a question here. I'm going to see if I understand it. When you say $60,000 or $150,000 savings, is that savings target per year? Typically, yes. There are some projects where there's a one-time return, but most of these are calculated on a time basis, particularly if there's systemic changes where you anticipate that the change is sustained, and frankly, if it's done right, that's the first cycle of savings. And an oil company, as we went through versions of certain going from site to site and effectively implementing the same project over and over again because of common processes and common activities, that savings for in effect, a one-time project started to multiply kind of like rabbits as you went from site to site, and the same solutions got implemented across the scope. Then the scope and scale of the enterprise converted, and I will tell you, although I take it with a serious grain of salt, that the leadership of that organization calculated the return from those 3 years of Lean Six Sigma projects in the billions. They calculated an initial return in excess of $1 billion. Now, senior managers and executives like to look good, so you may take that, but I can tell you that the savings from individual projects were significant, and they were sustained. So that's a long answer to what was a pretty straightforward question. In general, the savings are sustainable, and they're calculated year on year, but not always. There are instances where it's a one-time shot. Something is eliminated, and you can say, well, it's eliminated forever, so we can take credit for that savings from year to year. Most organizations have some approach to zero-based budgeting that won't look at it that way. But that has to do with accounting theory and what approach to your accounting systems your organization chooses. I have a second question, which is maybe the hardest one to answer. The question is, how do you transition this from the shop floor, from the Kaizen event type approach or the PICOS approach, if you're an old hand in the automotive world, to an enterprise? And I think the answer is you don't. You do it from the leadership down, that the strategy and the approach that's going to be taken, the tools, the competency development, the training, the targeting is done from the top, and in doing that, it comprehends that the leadership comprehends that other systems have to be attacked, and therefore teams are put together to look at costing, to look at accounting, to look at procurement, to look at IT, rather than simply have the struggle start at the shop floor. There is an argument, and the ballet book, B-A-L-L-E, accent, not ballet as in dance, called The Gold Mine, takes the approach of we're going to start on the shipping dock and work upstream. And of course, that is a way to do it. And as you work upstream, it's like taking the hose and putting your finger around it and moving you up. It's a kind of a variation on the approach that Goldratt takes, where you find Herbie and you start to work on Herbie, and every time you get Herbie leaned out somewhat, there's another Herbie. You keep doing that, which is somewhat similar to the idea of pulling the fingers around the hose. Having said that, what the theorists recognize is that you still, if you're going to get other systems like IT and procurement and staffing and development and competency management, even out to recruiting, and even organizational structure. The organization I referred to where I said we blew up the company, we literally, in the sense that the structure completely changed. Starting at the highest level of management and working through the entire organization, the company was completely restructured around these lean modules, if you will, these business units on the shop floor. So there are strategies that begin at the shipping dock and work upstream. But when they do, what happens is they run into these tributaries that you have to follow. You come to where IT or where purchasing or where staffing or something is now part of the problem. And you have to take that process and work upstream so that you end up transitioning off the shop floor into the enterprise-wide approach almost subconsciously, but it will only happen if the highest level of leadership is committed to making it happen. Otherwise, the don't fish in my pond resistance will be enormous, and it will be very difficult to change anything that isn't on the shop floor. There's a question about getting a recorded video. It will be posted on our website. You will be able to view it there, but recording it will not be a legitimate thing to do, if you know what I mean. But it will be there. It will be on our website. It will be available for viewing to once you've signed up and become a member of a resource user on our website. Well, that is all that I have in the way of questions. I can't believe I'm actually ending a webinar before the absolute last minute or 5 minutes after. We've got a minute or two. Are there any other questions out there? Now's your opportunity. Well, okay. I don't see anything appearing, so I'll keep an eye here on the screen, and if a question does pop up, I will respond through the written chat box rather than online. So at this point, I'm going to thank you all for your time and your interest. I hope the time was beneficial to you. I've enjoyed it, and I wish you a good day. Take care.